According to Zionist estimates, the number of Jews in Palestine in the early 16th century did not exceed 5,000. These people came to Palestine for strong religious motives and considerations, and most of them came from Spain after the expulsion of the Jews from it in the late 15th century. With every Jewish religious reform movement, some religious Jews came to Palestine. Israeli sources estimate the number of Jews in Palestine in 1881 at about 25,000 people, all of whom resided in Jerusalem, Hebron, Saft and Tiberias, and depended for a large part of their livelihood on charity that came to them from abroad. The colonial powers, especially the British, had been planning since the beginning of the 17th century to establish a strange entity in the heart of the Arab region. Its activities aimed at displacing Jews to Palestine were revealed in the period that followed the expulsion of the army of Muhammad Ali Pasha from Syria and Palestine in 1840 AD. However, these attempts were not successful because of the opposition of European Jews to this idea. The prevailing union among Jews in Western Europe was integration with the communities in which they lived. The Eastern European Jewry crisis had not yet come into existence. The Zionist immigration began in 1882 on a political basis. The stages it went through from then until 1948 can be divided into the following two main stages. From 1882 to 1918. At this stage, the countries of Eastern Europe, where the largest concentration of Jews in the world resided, entered the transition phase from the feudal system to the capitalist system. This was accompanied by stormy transformations in the economic, social and political fields that included the elimination of traditional Jewish professions such as mediation, brokerage, usury, and others. This led to widespread unemployment and economic devastation among the Jews. It was also accompanied by some acts of persecution directed at them because of their economic and social role.
The colonial powers tried to exploit the distress of the Jews of Eastern Europe in their plans to displace them, like other Jews, to Palestine in order to establish this strange entity in the heart of the Arab region. This stage witnessed the emergence of associations and movements in Russia calling for the return of the Jews to Palestine, such as the Beloved of Zion Association and the Bello movement. There is much evidence indicating that these associations were a Jewish cover to camouflage colonial movements in the field of displacing Jews to Palestine, and that they were directly linked to the British colonial apparatus. Although most Eastern European Jews solved their problem at that time by integrating into their societies and adapting to the new reality, or by emigrating to Western Europe and the United States, where integration and wealth were possible. Despite this, the colonial powers that were behind the Zionist project, before the Zionist movement itself crystallized, were able to. It recruits some misguided or adventurous Jewish elements and pushes them to immigrate to Palestine under the false slogan that says that Palestine is a land without a people, for a people without a land. The Ottoman authorities placed restrictions on the immigration of Jews to Palestine and their settlement there. But this obstacle could be overcome. The Jews arrived in Palestine in the form of pilgrims with temporary permits, remained there illegally, and then resided in the country permanently, independently, under the protection of foreign consulates in Jerusalem, especially British and then American, within the framework of the system of foreign privileges and protection of sex that European countries imposed on the empire. Ottoman Empire since the middle of the last century. Two waves of Jewish immigration to Palestine occurred at this stage. The first migration, 1883-1913. It took place in two main waves, the first between 1882 and 1884, and the second in 1890 and 1891. About 25,000 Jews came during this migration, most of them families with limited means from Romania and Russia. Zionist references indicate that this migration was organized and financed by the Lovers of Zion associations and the Bello movement. However, there is much evidence pointing to the role of some colonial figures and British agencies in organizing and financing this migration, such as the Palestine Settlement Development Fund, which was founded in 1852 by Colonel George Gawler, the former governor of Australia, and Sir Lawrence Oliphant, who visited Russia during that period and then came to Palestine and resided in Haifa for a period of time. The British colonial authorities then secured a Jewish cover to finance the transportation of immigrants to Palestine and their settlement in the person of Baron Edmund de Rothschild, who belongs to a large family of bankers and businessmen with branches in France, Britain, Germany, and other European countries. Rothschild was responsible for supervising and spending on the Jewish colonies in Palestine between 1886 and 1890. This was then entrusted to the Jewish Settlement Association, which was founded in London by the Jewish banker Baron Maurice de Hirsch, and Rothschild himself was a member of its board of directors. At this stage, about 450 Yemeni Jews also arrived in Palestine. The British authorities organized their displacement via Aden, and they settled in Jaffa. At the end of this period, about 350,000 dunams had been purchased, and 10,000 Jews were settled in a number of agricultural colonies. The second migration, 1904-1918, took place after the establishment of the Zionist organization and its supervision of immigration and settlement in Palestine. The number of immigrants there reached about 40,000, most of whom came from Russia and Romania. They were mainly penniless, adventurous young men recruited by Zionism and the colonial apparatus. Between 1911 and 1912, about 1,500 Yemeni Jews also arrived in Palestine and were distributed among Zionist agricultural colonies. The Hebrew slogan of labor was associated with this migration, and collective colonies, kibbutz, and cooperatives, moshavah, arose with it. In the wake of the failure of the first settlement attempts, which were based on fifth ownership and wage labor and recruited the Zionist movement and those behind it, the realization of the Zionist project requires creating a kind of strict central supervision of the settlement movement, restricting the freedom of immigrants, and not providing them with the opportunity to own the means of production and housing or own anything. They enable them to leave Palestine and return to their country of origin. On this basis, the idea of collective farms and Hebrew labor emerged to be the required restriction to tighten the Zionist grip on immigrants on the one hand, and to lay the foundations for the idea of removing Arabs from working in lands whose ownership is transferred to Zionist institutions on the other hand. The Zionist movement found in the immigrants of the second immigration the appropriate human material for this type of settlement. With the end of the second wave of immigration, due to the outbreak of World War I in 1914, the number of Jews in Palestine, according to estimates by Zionist sources, reached about 85,000 Jews, and the area of land they owned reached 418,000 dunams, and they now had about 44 agricultural colonies. Zionist immigration to Palestine stopped during the years of World War I. Zionist settlement activity stopped, and the number of Jews in Palestine decreased, reaching 55,000 in 1918. The exit of those who were sheltering from the system of foreign privileges is attributed to the exit of foreigners during the war.